The early months of 1942 confronted the high command of the German Wehrmacht with a stark, unforgiving strategic crisis on the Eastern Front, as the catastrophic failure of Operation Typhoon before the gates of Moscow had shattered the myth of blitzkrieg and exposed the critical structural limitations of the German war machine. The severe winter counteroffensives of the Red Army had pushed Army Group Center back to the Rzhev-Vyazma salient, inflicting heavy casualties and permanently disabling a vast percentage of the Wehrmacht's motor transport fleet, leaving many infantry divisions severely depleted and dependent on draft horses for tactical mobility. Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff of the Oberkommando des Heeres, remained steadfast in his conviction that Moscow must remain the primary, decisive objective of any summer offensive in 1942, arguing in his extensive war diaries that the Soviet capital was not merely a symbolic political prize, but the ultimate administrative, transport, and communications hub of the entire Soviet state. Halder maintained that a concentrated thrust to capture Moscow would sever the lateral railway connections between the northern and southern sectors of the Soviet Union, paralyze the Red Army's ability to mobilize its strategic reserves, and force Joseph Stalin to commit his remaining forces to a final, decisive battle of attrition on terrain that favored German tactical superiority. Conversely, Adolf Hitler viewed Halder's orthodox preoccupation with Moscow as a dangerous form of economic illiteracy, arguing that the modern engines of industrialized warfare required vast quantities of oil, and that the Third Reich's severe petroleum shortages would result in total mechanical paralysis by 1943 if the Wehrmacht did not capture the abundant oil fields of the Caucasus, specifically those located at Baku, Grozny, and Maikop. Hitler asserted that the capture of the southern agricultural regions and the oil reserves of the Volga would simultaneously starve the Soviet war economy while securing the long-term energy independence of the Axis powers, a strategic vision that he officially codified in Führer Directive No. 41 on April 5, 1942, under the operational codename Case Blue. As the summer of 1942 approached, the deep intellectual and strategic rift between the economic pragmatism of Hitler and the operational orthodoxy of Halder threatened to paralyze German planning, prompting a series of intense secret deliberations behind closed doors in East Prussia as the General Staff sought a compromise that could reconcile the critical need for southern oil with the paralyzing threat of a major Soviet concentration in the central sector. This debate was further complicated by the stark reports from the Wehrmacht's economic office, which estimated that Germany's domestic oil production and Romanian imports could only sustain active operations for another 6 months unless new sources were secured, creating an atmosphere of desperate urgency that forced both sides of the strategic divide to consider radical, unprecedented solutions. In late May of 1942, a tense series of war games conducted at the Army Group Center headquarters in Smolensk yielded a radical middle ground operational blueprint that would come to be known as the Ryazan Compromise, an elegant yet high-risk campaign design that attempted to bridge the strategic gap between Hitler's economic objectives and Halder's operational goals. Rather than dispersing the limited offensive power of the Wehrmacht across the vast, logistically punishing distances of the Caucasus, or attempting to breach the formidable, multi-layered Soviet defensive fortifications of the Rzhev-Vyazma salient directly west of Moscow, this new plan proposed a highly concentrated, narrow-front armored thrust originating from the Orel-Kursk sector. The operational concept dictated that the reconstructed 4th Panzer Army, supported by the veteran infantry divisions of the 2nd Army, would bypass the heavily fortified Rzhev-Vyazma defensive belt entirely, launching a sudden and violent offensive towards the northeast to capture the critical railway junctions of Tula and Ryazan. This operational trajectory was designed to strike the soft underbelly of the Soviet Central Defense Network, utilizing the natural geographic corridor between the Oka and Don rivers to screen the offensive's southern flank, while the armored spearheads raced to sever the vital transit lines that connected Moscow to the industrial centers of the Urals and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Simultaneously, a powerful motorized defensive screen consisting of the 6th Army and the 1st Panzer Army would advance to the Don River, establishing a heavily fortified, deep echelon defensive line along the river's northern bend to shield the main offensive thrust from any Soviet counterattacks launched from the south. By focusing the primary weight of the summer campaign on a localized, strategically decisive encirclement of the Moscow region from the southeast, the German High Command hoped to isolate the Soviet capital economically and logistically, achieving the paralyzing effects of Halder's central strategy while minimizing the immense logistical friction and exposed flanks that would inevitably plague a deep, unilateral push into the Caucasus. The plan also integrated elements of deception from the historical Operation Kremlin, seeking to keep the bulk of the Red Army's western front pinned down in defensive positions north of the city, while the panzer divisions struck from the unexpected direction of the south-southeast. The strategic efficacy of the Ryazan Compromise rested not on the romanticism of tactical combat or the territorial occupation of urban ruins, but on the cold, unforgiving mathematics of industrial logistics and the spatial distribution of the Soviet railway network. In 1942, the city of Ryazan served as the single most critical logistical bottleneck in the Western Soviet Union, representing the primary rail junction where the southern transit lines carrying Baku oil and the eastern transit lines carrying Kuznetsk coal and Ural steel converged before entering the vast radiating distribution network of the Moscow metropolitan area. By directing the primary weight of the 4th Panzer Army to seize and fortify Ryazan, the Wehrmacht aimed to construct an impenetrable logistical blockade, an iron ring that would effectively sever the lifeblood of the Soviet war economy at its most vulnerable point. The capture of this crucial junction would immediately halt the flow of Caucasian petroleum, which was transported northward from the Caspian port of Krasnovodsk and up the Volga River rail links, depriving the industrial factories of the capital and the armored units of the Western Front of their essential fuel reserves. Furthermore, the loss of Ryazan would permanently interrupt the heavy coal shipments from the Kuznetsk basin and the Urals, which were vital for generating the electrical power and heating required to sustain the massive armaments factories, repair depots, and civilian population of Moscow through the impending winter. Wargaming this scenario reveals that the economic isolation of Moscow would trigger a rapid systemic administrative collapse within the Soviet state, as the paralysis of the central transport network would prevent the Stavka from laterally shifting division-scale reinforcements between the northern and southern sectors of the front, leaving the remaining Soviet armies isolated, starved of ammunition, and unable to mount coordinated strategic operations. Additionally, the cutting of the Moscow-Ryazan rail line would sever the primary supply route of the British and American Lend-Lease goods arriving via the Persian corridor, halting the influx of critical items such as high-octane aviation fuel, rubber, and aluminum, which were essential for maintaining the operational capacity of the Red Air Force and the Soviet tank manufacturing industry. The execution of the Ryazan offensive in late June of 1942 immediately triggered a state of profound panic within the Soviet High Command. Yet the very success of Germany's prior strategic deception operations created a highly hazardous defensive environment for the advancing panzer divisions. Because Stalin had remained absolutely convinced that the primary German summer campaign would target Moscow, he had heavily reinforced the Western and Bryansk fronts, concentrating the absolute elite of the Red Army's strategic reserves directly in the path of the German advance. Under the urgent direction of General Georgy Zhukov, the Stavka rapidly redeployed the newly formed 1st and 16th Tank Corps, along with massive reserves of heavy artillery, to fortify the southern approaches to Tula and Ryazan, transforming the rolling terrain between the Oka and Don rivers into a deadly gauntlet of deep echelon defensive lines. As the 4th Panzer Army pushed toward Tula, it encountered incredibly stiff resistance from Soviet infantry divisions dug into deep, log-reinforced bunkers and supported by dense minefields and rapid-firing anti-tank gun strongpoints. The battle quickly degenerated into a brutal, high-casualty war of attrition along the Oka River, where German pioneering units struggled to secure and bridge the crossings under a constant, devastating barrage from Soviet rocket launchers and heavy artillery. Although the German spearheads managed to capture Tula and push to the outskirts of Ryazan by late August, their offensive momentum was severely degraded by the relentless multi-directional counterattacks launched by Zhukov's armored reserves, which targeted the exposed flanks of the narrow German corridor and forced the Wehrmacht to divert precious infantry divisions to defensive operations, severely limiting the resources available to complete the tactical encirclement of the capital. The logistics of the German supply lines, stretching over hundreds of miles of poor dirt roads and partisan-infested forests back to the railheads at Smolensk and Roslavl, began to buckle under the strain, as the daily delivery of fuel and ammunition fell far short of the operational requirements of the frontline panzer divisions, leading to a rapid decline in their combat readiness and mobility. In the final strategic assessment of the Ryazan Compromise, a rigorous analysis grounded in the historical war games conducted at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst reveals that even the most masterfully executed logistical blockade of Moscow would have ultimately succumbed to the overwhelming realities of Soviet strategic depth and the structural limitations of the German war machine. While the capture of the Ryazan railway junction would have inflicted severe paralyzing disruptions on the Soviet economy and paralyzed lateral troop movements, it could not halt the massive, unstoppable momentum of the Soviet industrial mobilization occurring safely behind the Ural Mountains. By the summer of 1942, the relocated factories of Chelyabinsk, Magnitogorsk, and Nizhny Tagil were already producing thousands of high-quality T-34 tanks and artillery pieces, operating completely independently of the Moscow transport hub and utilizing alternative northern rail corridors to supply the newly formed strategic armies. Furthermore, the German Wehrmacht's severe shortage of oil and replacement vehicles would have rendered it impossible to maintain the integrity of the long, incredibly vulnerable flanks of the narrow Ryazan corridor through the freezing winter months. As the temperature plummeted and the Russian winter set in, the overextended German divisions, starving of fuel and ammunition due to their own bankrupt supply lines, would have faced a massive coordinated Soviet winter counteroffensive launched from the depths of the Soviet strategic reserve. This counterattack, utilizing fresh Siberian divisions and massive armored formations, would have easily severed the fragile German supply lines at their base near Orel, turning the Ryazan salient into a massive frozen tomb for the 4th Panzer Army, and triggering a strategic catastrophe of even greater magnitude than the historical disaster at Stalingrad, demonstrating that in the ultimate ledger of empire, no tactical compromise could overcome the unforgiving mathematics of space and industrial production. The failure of this compromise plan would ultimately confirm that the structural imbalances of the German economy, plagued by severe material shortages, an inadequate transport network, and a complete lack of long-term strategic planning, rendered a decisive military victory over the Soviet Union a mathematical impossibility from the very outset of the campaign.